Thank you for joining us today. My name is Eliza, and I'm on the National Climate Assessment Team at the U.S. Global Change Research Program, or USGCRP. Before we get started, I want to draw your attention to a note in the chat box. Audio, or I should say microphones, are disabled for all participants, but if you have a question or a comment throughout the session today, please enter them into the chat box. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact Reed Sherman, who is our technical support person today. And please note that all participants are expected to be respectful and considerate towards others per the US GCRP Code of Conduct. Next slide, please. So I'm going to kick off the webinar with some background information about the National Climate Assessment before I turn it over to Jeremy Hoffman and the chapter authors. Next slide, please. So the U.S. Global Change Research Program was mandated by Congress in the Global Change Research Act of 1990 to assist the nation and the world to understand, assess, predict, and respond to human-induced and natural processes of global change. The program convenes 14 agencies to advance climate and global change science and to provide useful and usable information to decision makers. Next slide. That very same law that established the program also mandates a periodic scientific assessment known as the National Climate Assessment, or as you hear us refer to it, the NCA. The NCA is a quadrennial report. It analyzes the effects of global change on several sectors: the natural environment, agriculture, energy, land and water resources, transportation, human health, social systems, and biodiversity. USGCRP is charged with assessing current trends as well as projections for the next 25 to 100 years. And the report is used by a broad range of stakeholders, including organizations and individuals, for national policymaking, risk management in the private sector, local mitigation, adaptation planning, as well as by practitioners, utility managers, and educators. Next slide. Okay. So here are some kind of NCA5 basics. The first is that the NCA authors review a very large body of scientific literature from diverse information sources. They synthesize that information, they examine their confidence in our scientific understanding, and they evaluate uncertainties. NCA5 actually was written by 500 authors and 260 technical contributors from every state in the nation, as well as Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Guam, and Palau. The NCA is designed to be policy relevant, so authors distill their findings into accessible language framed around risks to people and to important resources. That said, the report is strictly not policy prescriptive. It does not advocate for a particular viewpoint or any kind of policy measure. The NCA, to that end, uses a range of future projections to help decision makers understand the fullest possible extent of risk that can be avoided or reduced under different scenarios, and it leads it up to the decision maker to ultimately determine their own risk threshold and make decisions. The assessment is compliant with all applicable federal laws and policies. That includes the Global Change Research Act, as well as other laws that govern things like information quality, accessibility, and transparency. Finally, the report process involves extensive review, including by the public. We have several opportunities for public engagement. We had a review by the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and we also had several government science reviews. Next slide, please. Alrighty, so now let's take a look at the NCA5 table of contents. So like previous national climate assessments, NCA5 covers national level topics, regions, and response actions. The report opens with an overview, which is then followed by 2 chapters dedicated to the physical science of climate change. Then there are the national topic chapters. We have 10 regional chapters and 2 response chapters. Although, I'd make the point that response actions are also discussed throughout the report, including in, the other chapters. The NCA table of contents has evolved over time, informed by user input. So NCA5 actually added 2 new chapters, one on economics and one on social systems and justice. We also have 5 new focus features that include compound extreme events, Western wildfire, COVID-19, supply chain, and blue carbon. Finally, we have a number of appendices, including one new one dedicated to climate change indicators. Alrighty, so now that we've gone through some introductory background, it is my pleasure to introduce Jeremy Hoffman, the chapter lead of the Southeast chapter. Jeremy will lead us through the rest of the webinar today. Over to you, Jeremy.
Thank you so much, Eliza, and for your tireless dedication to the NCA process, and especially the Southeast team. Good afternoon, everyone, if you're on Eastern Standard Time. My name is Jeremy Hoffman. I had the absolute honor to be the Southeast chapter lead author among a really amazing team of chapter authors, as well as a very long list of technical contributors that make up the Southeast chapter. I wanted to start off with, this presentation with a little bit of the specifics behind the Southeast chapter timeline. We held 6 public and stakeholder meetings, including one focused entirely on youth in 2021, and received some really great feedback on what would then become our chapter content. What's interesting is that I started the entire process by asking my chapter authors, if you were the only one writing this chapter, what would you write about? And then we asked that exact same question of our public and stakeholder audiences that joined these feedback meetings. And the correspondence between what we heard from our author team and what we thought was going to be important to add to the National Climate Assessment Southeast chapter, and what we heard from a wide range of stakeholder and public audiences were closely aligned. So that gave us confidence that we were already starting to develop a chapter narrative that would reflect the needs and concerns of Southeastern communities and residents. Now, I wanted to also highlight the fact that we went through, as you heard, this peer review process on several occasions. We had 3 entire pages of narrative review from the National Academies, which was greatly improved our chapter, as well as 75 comments from public reviewers that participated in that process. Now, I want to also say again, thank you to everyone that put time into helping us refine and make this chapter what it is today. I also wanted to start out by highlighting that you can go to the atlas.globalchange.gov and look at some of the data sets that present a variety of different global warming levels and their associated impacts on not only the Southeast, but around the country. So while we're going to be talking more specifically on, and we choose to highlight mostly RCP 4.5 in the figures that you see throughout our chapter, you can go to this website and look at a variety of different global warming levels, so the amount of total global warming reached and its associated impact on particular climate-related indicators like extreme hot days, extreme precipitation events, annual precipitation, and so on. Please, and especially if you are a teacher, this could be very, very important to developing class-related investigations that would lead to the same kinds of conclusions that we end up reporting in our chapter narrative. So please, atlas.globalchange.gov, take a look around. You can fly around the country looking at a variety of different climate impacts and their associated climate warming levels. I figured I would start by showing this. This is actually not in our chapter. This is figure 1.1, but I wanted to reflect on some of the major pieces that frame the Southeast chapter. We present a chapter for the Southeast that clearly positions the region as being disproportionately impacted by climate change threats in the past, in the present, and for every additional tenth of a degree of global warming that occurs, we will have more intense impacts into the future. We assess largely that our region's population is growing, mostly in metropolitan and coastal communities, as we'll talk about in a little bit. And as such, our region faces increasing threats from climate change with impacts across human health, our ecosystems, our economy, our infrastructure, and our food systems. You'll hear other authors talk about those areas of our chapter later on today. But our region's history of both racial and economic marginalization for generations has placed and continues to place poorer and communities of color at rapidly growing risk from climate impacts. Now, we also identified that proactive adaptation to strengthen our region's health, transportation, electricity, food system, you name it, types of infrastructure will have a huge offsetting effect on costs related to climate damages in the future. So, in a nutshell, we assess that patterns of climate risk, social vulnerability, and climate adaptation in the Southeast echo centuries of human history, and as such, reflect the decisions that will be made now and into the future. Some other things about our chapter that set it apart, that is in relation to previous NCA Southeast chapters, we have intertwined stories of indigenous practices across the Southeast, which you will see in highlight boxes and in our narrative. We also compare present day patterns of inequities across a variety of different sectors with their future climate impacts. And we've provided updated estimates of sea level, hurricane, extreme heat, and drought and precipitation related threats to the region. Now let's hop into more of the specifics. Our first key message reflects on our astounding amount of regional growth and how that increases climate risks. We've seen in the census data that many of our metropolitan and some of the largest, fastest growing metropolitan areas are in the Southeast, and that's expected to continue into the future, even under a kind of like middle ground population growth future scenario called SSP2. So you can see areas that are dark blue are places that will be expected to continue to grow, and those are mostly in metropolitan and coastal areas. Now, patterns of development in our urban and metropolitan areas in the Southeast over the last few decades have mostly been actually on the periphery, on the outside, in the suburban and exurban areas. And in fact, in the Southeast, we have the most amount of land that has been converted from forested to developed in the last few decades. It's like 2 million football fields worth of forested land went from forested to developed. This has huge implications for climate risks because we're putting people and things further outside of these kind of central urban cores. And that means that any given climate or weather related disaster has a larger footprint to then travel over and impact. Now, this also means that our development has been pushing further and further out into working natural landscapes that are largely unprotected, but huge biodiversity importance to the ecosystems of the Southeast. Now, what I was also just talking about this is that over the last few decades, the Southeast has tended to be one of the more frequently billion-dollar disaster regions in the whole entire national climate assessment. These have largely come as a result of hurricanes. We're one of the few regions that experiences this threat. And as such, as they've gotten more intense in their precipitation amounts, slowing down over the areas that they affect, and intensifying over a shorter amount of time before they make landfall, that makes hurricanes, an especially worrisome, costly weather-related disaster. And as people continue to, instead of maybe building outward in our metropolitan areas to accommodate that growth, that will only further expose people and things to climate and weather-related damage. Now, also, we know that these damages are expected to, and potentially in the present day, disproportionately impact those who cannot afford to adapt to those threats. So on the left, we see many of our housing, sensitive housing types like rental housing are at risk from current related, weather-related and natural disasters. And in the future, most of the projected changes in flood-related losses are in coastal and lower income and communities of color throughout the Southeast. Now, one of the other forms of flooding that is becoming more and more common has to do with sea level change. Sea level across the region, with large variability across the region, is expected to be somewhere around 2 feet by 2050. Now, that depends a lot on the ultimate realization of sea level rise scenario that we experience and other, kind of place specific things that can overprint and actually increase relative sea level in some places and not in others. But largely, it seems like the expectation is around 2 feet by 2050. This would have dramatic increases to potentially flood events across the Southeast. We highlight the city of Jacksonville, Florida, which in 2017 experienced a major flooding event from Hurricane Irma. Now, by 2050, under that kind of sea level rise scenario, that could happen or could be about 5 times more likely. These conditions could be about 5 times more likely. This would mean that they would happen once a decade. Hugely important, but also these, minor flooding events, which you can see outlined in red on the left, are also extremely important. And those could happen over 250 times a decade. So this sea level change is an extremely disruptive future and current chronic kind of risk in the region that we assess. But the Southeast is responding. The Southeast is adapting to and building equitable climate resilience to climate change in a variety of different ways, whether it's making use of nature-based solutions in cities, large infrastructural projects, adapting the way that we live and where we live, and using new tools to understand what to do next. The Southeast is adapting to climate change in a number of ways. So at this point, I'm going to hand the mic over to my colleague, Claudia Brown, from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, who's going to share the content behind our key message 2, which is about climate change worsening human health. Claudia?
Thanks, Jeremy. So the second key message of the Southeast chapter is that climate change is worsening human health and widening health inequities, as Jeremy mentioned. Human health and climate stressors are intimately linked in the Southeast with changes in temperature, precipitation, and sea level rise. We're seeing and anticipate seeing more frequent and intense heat, flooding, and poor air quality days. So community characteristics such as racial and ethnic population, chronic disease prevalence, age, and socioeconomic status can influence how climate change exacerbates, ameliorates, or introduces new health issues. And we're seeing that climate change is already impacting health in the region. So there are effective strategies to address the health impacts of climate change in the Southeast that have multiple benefits across social and environmental contexts. And so I'll dig into that a little more in the next slide. Southeasterners are consistently ranked among the unhealthiest in the nation, with shorter life expectancies than the rest of the US. And there is considerable variation within the region, as you can see in these maps. The map on the left demonstrates life expectancy in the Southeast, and the map on the right is estimating social vulnerability, which is based on information such as poverty, crowded housing, older populations, and lack of access to transportation, all of which may diminish a community's resilience to stressors which are made worse by climate change. As demonstrated by these maps, the areas where low life expectancy occurs are also the areas of high social vulnerability. So as I mentioned earlier, these are intimately linked with health, social vulnerability. Next slide. And the present day inequities will be amplified and gaps widened by climate change. The map on the left is demonstrating how high energy bills disproportionately impact rural and under-resourced residents, elderly residents on fixed incomes, as well as communities of color. That purple color on the map is representing areas where there are a high percentage of the population that is Black, Indigenous, and/or people of color, referred to in the legend as BIPOC. And the percentage of low and moderate income households with a high energy burden, which means households that spend disproportionate of their income on energy costs relative to their income. So demonstrated by this map on the right is that these communities will also experience some of the greatest increases in the number of extreme heat days due to climate change. Next slide. And for several states in the Southeast, major blackout events are occurring most often during the warm season, increasing risk to heat-related illness. Major blackouts during the warm season generally occur during heat waves, placing older people at higher risk of heat exposure and heat-related illness because they do not have access to air conditioning. This chart is showing reported major blackout events, which are defined as electrical grid failures affecting more than 1,000 residents for more than 1 hour. And this is looking at data from 2011 to 2021. The orange indicates blackouts that occurred during the warm season, which is May through September, and the blue is the non-warm season, which is October to April. Next slide. And one final example of the climate impact on health in the Southeast is presented here, as rising levels of air pollution from a warming climate pose profound threats to human health. The map on the left is demonstrating the present-day patterns of particulate matter and how they're associated with excess mortality. The map on the right is demonstrating potential future patterns of premature death in people 65 and older due to PM 2.5. And this is showing that even when accounting for reduced particulate emissions in the future due to developments such as vehicle electrification, the health of Southeasterners is particularly sensitive to poor air quality. And so just to wrap this up, I just want to highlight that this is just a portion of the health issues that the Southeast is experiencing and will continue to experience under a changing climate. So I encourage you to explore this section a little bit more. Next slide.
Okay, next up, thank you so much, Claudia. Next up, we're going to be exploring a little bit of our key message 3, which is all about the economy in the Southeast and its associated climate risks. We're going to be hearing from Janie Smith-Camp. Please, Janie.
Thanks, Jeremy. So as we know, the Southeast has had years of disproportionate risk and challenges across the region. And our key message 3 is focused on households, jobs, and economic security. Next slide. So over the last few decades, economic growth in the Southeast has been concentrated in and around urban centers that depend on climate-sensitive infrastructure and regional connections to thrive. Global warming is expected to worsen these conditions and the impacts associated with the extreme weather events and natural hazards that we experience in the Southeast. These events are expected to impact supply chains and cause ripple effects on the cost of goods that we depend on and potentially services. So when you start looking at the Southeast, we really need a coordinated approach to think about the inequities across the region, interdependencies among infrastructure systems, and between rural and urban communities to help secure the region's economic vitality. Here, we're considering some of the capacity to adapt and respond to extreme weather events and natural hazards associated with climate change. Children born to parents who make lowest incomes tend to grow up and make lower incomes, and there's research to validate this. So in this graph here, the map shows a consideration of the rural capacity to withstand and respond to extreme weather events and be prepared in coordination with household income at age 35 using 2015 dollars. And as you can see, when you look at the grid for the color scheme to the right, the legend, those lighter colored cells or blocks in the region have the lowest capacity and lowest income across the board. And so these areas are less able to withstand the potential climate risks that will be coming to them. The areas that are shaded in the dark purple have the highest income and the most capacity to respond. And you can see some of these highlighted across the map. Definitely there's specific areas that could be focused on for areas of great need and areas that may be better equipped to respond to climate change. The lack of resources can leave some of these communities in that lower gray quadrant of coloring at more risk to damage due to future climate change. Next slide, please. So one other thing our team considered was, what are the costs of climate change and damages across the region if unmitigated? So based on current projections using a RCP of 8.5, there's an estimate that many of the communities are going to have a significant percentage of their gross county domestic product focused on responding and managing damages of climate change. So as you can see, some of the northeastern portions of the region tend to fare better and are expected to spend less on economic damages, total damages from climate change. But that does not mean anyone is immune. And all communities are potentially at risk of future climate change impacts. Next slide, please. As we were considering the regional impacts of extreme weather events, we took into consideration the diverse communities of the Southeast and the different types of extreme weather events that climate change has in store for the region. The Southeast economy relies on, ports and rivers, rail, air, and other road transportation networks, which help get goods and products to our homes, helps move agricultural products and other manufactured goods to market. And it affects the communities both ways when those systems are disrupted. So the Southeast is at risk, as Jeremy said, of climate change related impacts such as sea level rise, flooding, extreme heat, drought, and other hazards. But we can take a proactive approach to offset the future climate related damages across the region. Next slide. The Southeast faces some of the highest challenges and economic risks related to energy infrastructure. Transportation infrastructure. So when we think about, rail and roadway, we have a comparison here in this figure comparing adaptation versus no adaptation versus proactive adaptation. We can see that thousands and potentially millions of dollars of taxpayer funds could be saved by proactive adaptation to climate change moving into the future. Next slide. So here we're looking at annual energy infrastructure costs with proactive adaptation versus no adaptation. So we focus both on transportation and energy infrastructure because so many communities are dependent on those infrastructure systems, and other infrastructure systems are highly dependent on these two infrastructure sectors. We have some of the highest economic risks related to energy infrastructure damage, especially thinking about the Gulf Coast area and other parts of the region where we have different sources and forms of energy that could be impacted differently or similarly. So in the maps here, this is a projection looking at 2050 under an intermediate relative concentration pathway. And proactive adaptation could save as much as twice the total cost in 2017 dollars of no adaptation. So these costs can be passed to consumers and residents in multiple ways. And other infrastructure systems such as water is dependent on energy. And so higher energy costs because of lack of adaptation could lead to other costs in other sectors going up. So proactive adaptation is absolutely worth the investment when you look at the Southeast. All right, back to you, Jeremy.
Thank you so much, Janie, for that quick tour around the economic key message. Thank you so much. At this point, I wanted to make sure that we highlight the inclusion of the indigenous practices that I mentioned as part of the introduction to our chapter. And so we're really fortunate to have Aranzazu Laskaran, who will share a little bit of our chapter spotlight on indigenous peoples. Aranzazu, are you there? You might still be on mute, Aranzazu.
Okay, there we go. Thank you, Jeremy. I appreciate it
Great.
very much. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity. Climate change continues to negatively affect the livelihoods, health, and cultural practices of indigenous peoples, as well as the ecological resilience of their territories. However, in spite of these effects, communities are also actively working to implement thoughtful and creative adaptation strategies that are unique to their particular circumstances and histories. Additionally, their ability to exercise their own aspirations for climate adaptation is often undermined by institutions and policies. We presented here in box 22.2, if you could advance the slide, Jeremy, thank you, a case study where proactive collaboration can lead to better outcomes. Here, the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor members worked with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, known as FEMA, to identify policy barriers and revisions for Gullah Geechee citizens seeking disaster and recovery aid. Former federal disaster aid policies did not, in this circumstance, recognize the uniqueness of heirs' properties, where possession of lands is authentic, but documentation can be complicated. The corridor used its communication network to educate communities about the newly created disaster aid revisions made to support owners of heirs' property before the arrival of the 2022 hurricane season, so that when powerful storms struck communities in South Carolina, the corridor team reached out quickly to families and directed FEMA representatives to areas that were the hardest hit. And through its community-driven ad hoc subcommittee on natural resources and climate change, the corridor has also used a similar grassroots approach to understand how climate change may be experienced differently in the coastal communities of the corridor, and has worked to identify nature-based solutions that may benefit communities. Next slide, Jeremy. I'd like to acknowledge my fellow co-author, Marie Schaefer and Adam Griffith, who provided technical input for this particular case study. We wove indigenous perspectives and ecological knowledge throughout the chapter and really the whole assessment. We shed light on the challenges indigenous communities face, but also the already active adaptation measures they're pursuing. In many ways, indigenous communities are using the most time-tested and creative strategies because they are unique to their culture and places of local inhabitants. For this case study, we focused on river cane, and also known as canebrake or swamp cane, and just one of 3 native bamboos to North America. So I'd like to provide an overview of the photos here that were provided by tribal communities for this chapter. On the left, you see river cane growing along the French Broad River in Buncombe County of North Carolina, and not far from the eastern band of Cherokee Indians Reservation. On the right, a basket weaver, Ramses King of the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, creates a double weave basket from river cane. River cane was once abundant, is now critically endangered at just 2% of its original range. And it provides food, textiles, basketry, wildlife habitat, medicine, hunting tools, and musical instruments. River cane as a case study provided an excellent example of a species that is both threatened, but where restoration by tribal communities is actively taking place. It's also an example of a species, and indeed a whole ecosystem, that has multiple co-benefits. Additionally, provided an example of tribal efforts to maintain sovereignty and cultural continuance. This is a concept promoted by Native scholar Kyle Powys White that describes the overall degree of adaptive capacity a society has when we take all its collective capacities into account, from food systems all the way to gender systems. And let me give you a good news story. 2 weeks ago, the Catawba Indian Nation was awarded $4.8 million from the America the Beautiful Challenge to use a cultural approach to ecological restoration by engaging Catawba citizens in replacing 2 culverts, stabilizing stream banks, and converting land to native prairie, and doubling the size of canebrake on tribal lands. Thank you, Jeremy. I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Aranzazu, and especially for the good news story. It's really nice that we're able to highlight River Cane and then have such a great story to follow up in the Southeast immediately following the release of our report. So thank you so much. And last but certainly not least, the last key message of our Southeast chapter in the NCA5 is all about our food systems and agriculture. And so I would like to invite Pam Knox to share a little bit of the findings from key message 4.
All right, well, thank you, Jeremy. Welcome, everybody. We're glad that you're here. Agriculture certainly is not the least of the economic drivers of the Southeast, and so we felt we really needed to include it. Agriculture overall for the globe probably causes or affects 24% of greenhouse gas emissions, and so it's certainly part of the threat, but agriculture also provides a lot of solutions, and so we wanted to highlight both of those factors in our section here. If we go on to the next slide. I understand some of these slides are pretty complicated, so I definitely encourage you to go and read the chapters later online and spend more time looking at these. One of the things that we want to point out in our chapter is that even though drought is a big driver in the Southeast, as well as Jeremy mentioned, many other extreme weather events, drought does not affect everyone the same way. Janie showed a slide that really indicated that a lot of the economic losses that we're likely to see in the future are in the southern part of Georgia and along the coast there, which are also areas where we get a lot of droughts, as you can see in this figure here. Those are areas that are likely to be especially impacted by future climate change. And of course, you know, when we have losses in agriculture, we also have losses in the tax base. And so we're having losses in libraries and schools and in the cost of local government as well. So this really affects all different levels of society. In this case, one of the things we wanted to point out with the figure that's shown here is that the areas that are getting the most drought are also areas where many of the farmers don't have a lot of resources. Either they own small amounts of land or they don't have access to things like irrigation. And so they're especially impacted by that compared to larger commercial farmers, which may have deep wells and are able to do more irrigation. And so that is something that we really need to consider, because a lot of the agriculture is done by small family farms and farmers who do not farm huge amounts of land. We go to the next slide. This talks about the agricultural yields that are expected to change over time. And one of the things you'll notice on this figure is that there are some areas where the yield is actually expected to increase. Some of these areas are a little bit farther to the north. There are areas where we may expect to see more rainfall, and so more potential, at least for irrigation, and less problems with loss of evapotranspiration from the plants. But we do expect to see changes in yield that are reductions in a lot of the different crops. Obviously, it depends on the crop. Some crops are more adapted to warmer weather and drier conditions, and farmers are pretty smart people, so they are always looking for ways to innovate. And they also have the option to help us solve the problem by how we maintain the herds of cattle. You know, we can feed them different feeds and cut down on methane emission, for example, or we can go towards different crops that are better adapted to warmer conditions, such as growing satsuma oranges or olives in parts of the Southeast where they were not able to be grown before. And so while farming is certainly part of the problem and is contributing to global climate change through emissions of greenhouse gases, it's also a huge part of the solution. And we wanted to make sure that that was recognized in this as well. So I'm going to stop here and make sure we have plenty of time to answer questions. I've seen quite a few pop up. I will turn it back to Jeremy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pam. And thanks again to the other members of the chapter author team for contributing to this presentation. I wanted to take a second to recognize everyone else that had a hand in the generation of the report chapter. Our coordinating lead author for the federal government, Stephen McNulty. Steve was unfortunately unable to join us today, but as you can see, we had a very wide-ranging team of chapter authors and technical contributors, and then a special shout out to Tisha Holmes from Florida State University, who was acted as our review editor, which is an incredibly important role to play in the finalizing and evaluation of how we responded to National Academy and public comments. And again, shout out to Aliza, who was our primary coordinator for USGCRP, as well as Joshua Hernandez, who is no longer with the office, but it will do really great things in the future. So at this point, Aliza, why don't we switch it over to taking some of these questions, and we'll look forward to having a conversation about the Southeast chapter.